The Union Jack is flying half-mast. The BBC is broadcasting an endless stream of archive footage, and the posters on the bus stops show her black and white picture. The Queen is dead. And with that, the UK mourns. She reigned for 70 years. Is this an end of an era? We are going to discuss this question today with two scholars specialized in dynasties and kings and queens. This is a current affairs program organized by Radboud Reflex and Vox. I'm Adriaan Duivenman from Radboud Reflex, and I will lead this conversation. First, we will have a conversation over here, but at the end, you can ask all your questions you have, and I think it will be plenty. We will discuss the British monarchy, its long past, its long future, or not. We will hear that, I think, in the coming half hour. So I will first introduce the speakers. On my right hand, on your left, Dr. Dennis Kersten, literary scholar and Great Britain expert. On my right, on your right, Dr. Dries Raeymaekers, historian studying dynasties and monarchy. And I will begin with something I saw on the BBC this morning. A long queue for the coffin of the Queen. People standing at the end of the line there will have to wait for 30 hours. You are our university's Great Britain whisperer. You can maybe climb in the psyche of these people. Why are they standing there for 30 hours?
Good question. That's a question I'd like to ask them myself, of course. 30 hours. I think that is because the passing of the Queen and all the media coverage have led to a kind of hype. And perhaps people are in need of some kind of escape route with all the news that has been engulfing us recently with wars in other parts of Europe, energy crises, we're just sort of recovering from the COVID period, etc. So I can understand why people would focus on this story about the Queen and would want to go to the Westminster Hall to pay her a final visit, but to stand there for 30 hours, yes, that is a psychologically interesting question.
and you mention it as, you say that it can be an escape for the Brits, but why can the death of a monarch be an escape?
Well, from all kinds of other concerns in society, and Britain does have a few concerns. Brexit, obviously, and perhaps the impact of Brexit so far has been smothered by COVID and other crises. So yeah, I can see why they would feel a need to escape into another story. So there's enough to actually deal with. And I also hope that this particular story doesn't overshadow the other concerns or events happening. So for the new Prime Minister, it must have been a disaster to, on the second day of her new job, to be confronted with the death of the Queen. At the same time, all the spotlights were on her for a solution to all kinds of crises in the country, and perhaps that's now being delayed, as it were. She doesn't have to come up with a plan for the energy crisis just now. She has a plan, so she has more time now to think about that too.
So this is a story about the present and future concerns, but it's also a story that is rooted in the past. As a historian, Dr. Raeymaekers, sorry, how do you watch and read the news as a historian? What do you see when you see this Operation London Bridge unfold?
Yeah, well, as a historian, I'm having a field day, of course, right? This is a gigantic moment for everybody interested in dynasties and in monarchy. So in that sense, I'm really enjoying myself, actually. Which is a terrible thing to say. For me, of course, the important thing is the ritual that surrounds the entire event. The protocol that's now starting up, and just being able to finally see, because the last time was quite a while ago, a royal burial, and of course I'm very anxious to see the coronation, which will probably happen in I would say maybe half a year or maybe a bit later. I'm really looking forward to that, actually, to be able to finally see what I've been studying all these years now, and then to experience it in the flesh, as they say. Yeah.
So you're actually seeing the past. Are we seeing an historical reenactment here?
Well, I think we're certainly seeing a ritual that, in its origins, is ages old. And I'd be very curious to see how they're going to adapt certain parts of it in order to sort of try and basically to try and see how they can sort of answer the current problems and current concerns, and perhaps give a reply to that true ritual.
And what kind of concerns are there?
Well, I think that one of the main ones is, of course, how is the monarchy going to deal with all the accusations now of the imperial past? I think they're going to have to do something about that, or at least address it in some form. And I'd be curious to find out how exactly they're going to go about.
You mean also how they try to organize the marriage of Harry and Meghan in such a way that it was more inclusive, perhaps, than it had been before. So the coronation of Charles could be different from the one of Elizabeth II, to recognize that we've moved on 70 years.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think there's also, especially on Twitter, a lot of discussion on indeed the colonial heritage that is associated with the royal house. Dr. Kerstens, how do you, what does, if you read the media discussion, what do you see? How do the Britons reflect on their colonial heritage in relation to the monarchy? Can they disconnect it?
Well, first of all, I think the first couple of days, so last week she died on Thursday, first couple of days, I think most of the coverage was very positive. So she just died, and the, let's say, more critical voices, they weren't really heard, certainly not in the BBC coverage. And that's sort of, every day, I said just before this particular talk, I said, well, every day that changes, and I see the critical voices becoming more stronger by the day, as it were. But especially from abroad, I'd say. So on Twitter, from India, African countries, Jamaica, former British colonies, there are more and more stories being told about, well, you're almost like worshipping the Queen as a kind of god, but she was, in her name, things were committed, atrocities by the British government, etc., that also need to be remembered. She also symbolized a particular system that caused a lot of harm. And not in person, so they're not attacking Elizabeth as a person, but as a symbol. She was the queen still when Britain had colonies and were committing crimes also, and pretty close to home as well, in Ireland, Northern Ireland, etc. So yeah, I think those voices will become more strong as the days move on, in the UK as well.
We are going to move to the worship element later on, the worshipping her as a god. But before that, how do you think that they, in the ritual, can reckon with the colonial past? How can they adapt these centuries-old, or acclaimed centuries-old traditions?
Good question. Well, I'm sure they're going to have to look at the speeches and the things that are being said, the oaths that are being taken, which are bound to contain some elements that nowadays would no longer be, appropriate. So I think they're going to pay a lot of attention to those kinds of detail. Similar to what happened here in the Netherlands, of course, with the golden carriage. I think it's going to go into that direction.
Okay. Something else that some people in the British newspapers argue that is maybe outdated about rituals is the very religious element in it. And then you already mentioned the worshipping part. The British monarch has the title of being the protector of the faith, head of the Anglican Church. What's the role of religion in the rituals we see the coming days and the rest of the year of the coronation?
Well, I guess, of course, as you said, the British monarch is the head of the Anglican Church, so that's a very important element to them. I think the most important aspect we're going to see will be during the coronation, actually, where the biggest moment will be the anointing of the new king. The British monarch is anointed, which means that he's being that the Archbishop of Canterbury, I think it is, who will anoint the new monarch, which basically is a consecration of the new monarch. That's where the religious element comes in, and they are given their power by God, essentially. And I think that's, in terms of something to look, what we can look forward to, that will be the main event. It's also important to realize that this is not something they deal with lightly. Back in 1953, when the Queen was crowned, her coronation was one of the very first televised, I think, royal events in Britain. The entire event was being filmed, but there was one thing that they skipped because it was too sacred, and that was the anointing. It was felt at the time that this moment, this precious moment, was too sacred for viewers to be able to witness. And I'm very curious to see what's going to happen with Charles in that respect.
It's interesting you mentioned the coronation on television, because the first question, why do people line up for 30 hours to see the Queen? That also has to do with the media coverage, I suppose. In 1953, lots of British people bought a television to see the Queen being crowned. So that was the television age starting. That's how long she's been a queen, right? So now we have a very rich media landscape. Back then, people still had to buy the television. So I think that's also why lots of people, they salute the Queen a final time. It's because they realize this is an historic moment, right? It's not just a monarch who's been on the throne for about 10 years dying. It's an end of an era that started with the emergence of television, which to us sounds like Middle Ages. Yeah.
Maybe even prehistory. Okay. I think we are going to return to that later on. First, I think I want to in the British royal family is also called the firm, and what I understood from court history or court historians, they use this analogy of the royal house as a corporation, even kind of not literally, but as an analytical tool. So for them, it's more than just a quip. And you also use it in that way. Exactly. So how can we understand the British royal family as a firm?
Right, exactly. This is actually an insight that's been there since, let's say, the 1970s. But only recently, historians have really started to work with the concept of the dynasty as a business company, you could say, a firm that needs to mark its own boundaries, that needs to discuss leadership, that needs to discuss succession, that needs to discuss the management of property and assets. And in that sense, they're very aware of who can be the CEO of such a company, which is, of course, the monarch himself or herself. And then you have all the other family members who get to play a role in that as well. In a way, their main goal, obviously, is to stay on top. And that is like a company that always needs to take into account the money they have and to be able to build on that. This too is true for a monarchy. They need to be to think of strategies in order to stay in power, you could say. And in that sense, a lot of the strategies they use can be compared to what happens in businesses today.
And if we take this analogy one step further, is there competition? We already heard a different media landscape. Is there something that can replace monarchy or can replace a royal family?
Well, I would say dynasty is everywhere still. If you look around, you only have to think about the Trump family, the Clintons, the Bushes, and you could also look further afield at certain dictators that are currently still in power. It's still all about the family, and in that sense, I think it remains an important governmental structure to look at, or form of rule to look at and to study, I think. And likewise in businesses. Perhaps there are people here who've seen the TV series Succession. Well, it's all about thinking of strategies. Who is going to be next in line, and who are the people that you certainly don't want to take over. Those things remain important, whether in a traditional monarchy or elsewhere in society, I think.
And perhaps the British monarchy itself has replaced something that went before, and it's become a kind of secular religion or an institution that people use to give meaning to their lives or structure order society, have a hierarchy, etc. So perhaps there's a need for that especially, and now that need is answered by the monarchy, but it could also be something else perhaps in the future.
But that's interesting, because she came to the throne in 1953. More than 70 years almost. 70 years have passed. In that period, a lot has changed in the attitudes in Britain. Same-sex marriage was legally approved. Prejudices to people of color have changed, or there are less prejudices. Economic circumstances changed. Women went into the labor force. So all these attitudes have changed drastically. But somehow the monarchy remained above the 60% approval rating over this whole period. How do you understand this? How can we understand that despite all these changes, they somehow are the institution that people still believe in?
Well, but they're also criticized a lot for perhaps being behind on these kind of developments that you've just outlined. I think at the end of the day, not everybody is a monarchist, of course. So not all those people who are in that queue for 30 hours are partaking in the worshipping of the monarch or the monarchy, but are rather they are rather part of the historic moment. They realize this is an event, the event of the year, of the century, etc. I want to be part of that. So I'm not sure if the survival of the monarchy, the fact that it still exists, means that all people who still support it are 100% uncritical and feel the monarchy is really up to date on those kind of issues that we just talked about.
And if I might add to that, if you think about it, monarchy itself is actually a rather persistent system of government. It's been there for thousands of years. And I think one of the secrets there is we always tend to think of monarchy as something that's interested in continuity. And that's, of course, its main goal, to stay on top. But continuity always comes with flexibility. And in fact, when you start researching history and history of monarchy, you'll realize that monarchy itself has always been very good at flexibility. It doesn't seem that way in appearance, but when you start studying the ritual they use, you can always tell that there's changing little things in order to keep up with the times. So that flexibility, I think, is crucial for the monarchy to survive. And it'd be interesting to see what they're going to think of this time in order to sort of remaining in keeping with society.
Do you think that Charles III is flexible?
Well, before I answer that question, I also thought we in Western democracies with monarchies, we do realize that the heads of state, they don't have executive power really. So the problem that perhaps the British monarchy might not be up to date with certain progressive ideals or values, etc. We criticize them for that. At the same time, we're willing to accept that the monarchy is still around, perhaps more for the fairy tale aspect of it or the fictional aspect. Because we realize they don't really run the country. They are still very influential, certainly in Britain more than here. But we realize, well, they can't behead their opponents, as it were. So perhaps that also means that we're willing to accept an potentially outdated institution in modern society.
Because it is a fairy tale.
Because that part of the story is important to people. So they can accept it because it has that aspect, even though they realized, in other senses, the monarchy might be behind the times. Yeah. And Charles, I don't know, he said he wants to be the protector of the faiths. so not just the Protestant faith. So I'm really curious to see how he's, perhaps already in the coronation ceremony, how he's going to give shape to that ideal. I think, and he's had lots of time, I think he's really studied what's happened the past couple of decades and how he could perhaps improve on certain things that his mother perhaps didn't do perfectly, as it were. So, and I think, yeah, he will study. He will also ask that same question: how can I modernize the monarchy in such a way that the monarchy will survive again in a climate that could also be very critical of the, let's say, more conservative values?
What did his mother not do perfectly? What do you mean then?
Well, for instance, the criticism being voiced now, on the one hand, you have people admiring her for being steadfast and for, in a way, making sure the institution of the crown is always protected and the monarchy survives, etc. And as a kind of, you can say it's kind of admirable to be in that position for 70 years and not show emotion, as it were, or not being outspoken about certain political issues, because that's the way to survive. But those critics of her will say, yes, but if you have the choice between voicing your concern about, you know, the negative effects of colonialism, or the survival of the crown as an institution, I mean, why not do the first, right? Why is it so important to stay neutral, to be objective, to make sure that the crown, as it were, survives, while lots of your subjects and other people in the world, they're waiting for a sign from you that you don't condone certain, let's say, actions of the governments that are being formed in your name.
So you think that Charles the Third is actually very tactical when he speaks out his mind. So, or that could be tactical to speak out what his opinion is on these topics.
Yeah, he has done so in the past more often. So he's been more outspoken on certain political issues than his mother. And again, I'm curious to see how he will continue this as a king. He will be very careful, I guess. So I think he will also try to honor his mother by continuing her style in a way and very subtly try and modernize it. I think that's what we can expect for the near future. So of course, he will try and be king in his way, but it won't be a kind of revolutionary new approach. I don't think so. And I hope he will take into account all that criticism and deal with that in a king-like way. Yeah.
If monarchies are so good at adapting, isn't the biggest problem of the monarchy not that the monarch is a person? Shouldn't we just in the future appoint a robot or something that doesn't make uncomfortable jokes like Charles III? And
well, critics of Elizabeth will say we had that with
That's true.
It's an interesting thought, I would say, but I think that the human element is still rather important here. The ability to be able to show empathy as a monarch, the ability to go to people, talk to them, show concern for the people. I think that those elements are very human in nature. I think that remains important for a monarch.
But can a monarch be too human, or can it? They also have to retain a certain kind of distance between them and the general audience. How does that work then?
Well, this is actually a crucial element of monarchy, I think. I think it was Walter Bagehot, a 19th century scholar of monarchy, among other things, who said that it would be wrong. I'm misquoting him here. It was something about let's not put daylight onto magic. There's a certain element to monarchy that is magical, that is, of course, entirely fictional. They've created a fiction. And it's rather important for them that fiction remains there and that people still get to see it and to experience it. And this is, of course, something that's been going on for ages now. It was already so in the early Middle Ages, where the distance between a monarch and the subjects is always an element of contention. People are trying to get closer, but it's important for a monarch to keep his distance or her distance. Because the distance is essential, actually, in order to be taken serious, to be seen as a legitimate monarch. I think. I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I think that the tension that kings and queens have to deal with is that often people want to look up to them, as in they should have maximum integrity, as it were, and be morally superior to us in a sense, but they shouldn't look down upon us. So they shouldn't be arrogant or snobbish or take for granted that they have certain privileges. That's, of course, a very difficult balance to get right. Yeah.
I know that it's, you're a literary scholar, historical literary scholar, you're a historian. Those types of people don't like to look in the future and predict, but I'm going to try to still pull it out of you. In 20 years, will there still be a British monarchy? Can I start with you?
I think so, yes. I think there will still be a monarch. I don't know if it will still be Charles by that time, but I think there will still be a monarch, yeah.
And why do you, what makes it?
Well, because history has proven that monarchy is a very persistent system, and you know, if you don't want monarchy anymore, you have to start thinking about alternatives. And I'm not sure that UK right now is prepared to start that discussion. So I think they're going to stick to it
Until the next Oliver Cromwell stands up and beheads the Queen. What do you think?
I agree. I think the British monarchy is part of the psyche of the UK, so part of their national identities. That's a whole different story, but more so than in the Netherlands, I'd say. So if they get rid of the monarchy, they get rid of a kind of self-image, and that's harder to do, as it were. But I have to admit, a few years ago, I thought that Brexit wouldn't be possible. So 20 years' time is a long period. I was actually hoping for William to become king last week, but of course they have to then ask Charles to step aside. That's not going to happen, obviously. It hasn't happened. But yes, I think there will be a monarchy still. I do wonder about the countries that have Charles as their head of state outside of the UK, as part of the Commonwealth, if they will still have the British monarch as their head of state in 20 years' time, because this would be the moment to become a republic. And they've had those, Australia, they've had those discussions before, and there is a kind of momentum to speed up that particular debate. So yeah, that'll also be interesting to see.
So he will still be a king, but less of a king with less countries.
I think so, yes.
Okay. And as I said, you both study history. This is also hard to ask a historian, whether you can learn from history, but can Charles III learn from any predecessor? Is there another Charles he could learn from?
Both Charles the First and Second, I'd say.
Yeah. Well,
Charles the First.
If I were the new king, I would definitely not look at Charles the First as an example, for the simple reason that he was beheaded in the end, and that didn't end well for him. Charles II can, in a way, I think, be an example in the sense that he was very popular. He loved to party. He had he had a very brilliant court. And he, of course, reintroduced in English society at the time a new sense of possibility after a very dark revolutionary age. So perhaps in that sense he could take an example there. If I had to choose a monarch that Charles could look at, I would say go for Elizabeth I, who also reigned for a very long time, who became one of the most powerful monarchs of her time. And in that sense, I think that would be a good example. There are, of course, a number of problems there that he would have to take into account, but I would go for Elizabeth I as yeah.
So Charles II, of course, also restoration king. So perhaps Charles III could be some kind of restoration king, as in the UK is in need of some healing, I'd say. If the Tories can't make that possible, then perhaps the king can be the inspiration for that kind of healing process. Predecessors, perhaps Elizabeth's father, who was well respected, who wasn't meant to be king. He's the stammering king from the King's Speech, that particular film. I think Elizabeth, all of her 70 years, I think she the only thing she wanted to do was to make her father proud, which may sound very sentimental, but in a way, the way she's been queen over the past so many decades was in honor of her father. And perhaps, yeah, if I have to think of a predecessor that Charles should take as an example, I'd mention him actually, because the further you go back in time, the more problematic the earlier monarchs become. Yeah.
Maybe he's going to lock people up in the Tower of London.
Yeah, so he shouldn't do that. So, but Elizabeth's father, very modest man, calm, etc., well respected, a figure of authority during the Second World War. That would be the one example to follow.
I think that this is a nice ending for the conversation here.